Okay, the next item on the agenda is an update on the 2016-17 Regulatory Framework Program as outlined in CMD 17M49 and M49.A. And Mr. Tory, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres de la Commission. My name is Brian Tory, Director General of the Regulatory Policy Directorate. With me today are Ms. Lynn Forrest, Director of the Regulatory Policy Analysis Division, Ms. Karen Owen-Whitred, Director of the Regulatory Framework Division, and other CNSC staff are available here as well to provide support and answer any questions you may have. We are pleased to be here today to present our regular update on the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Program. The last update to the Commission was provided in September of 2016. Although we are regularly before you at meetings to discuss specific regulatory documents, this report provides us with an opportunity to highlight the important work we are doing to engage in broader regulatory initiatives in the federal government and to discuss our forward plans which help ensure the CNSC continues to have a modern and comprehensive regulatory framework. Our presentation today will provide an overview of the Regulatory Framework Program covering both an explanation of our processes and some of the highlights from the past year. We will then describe our involvement in some of the Government of Canada's regulatory reform initiatives. There are two main elements making up the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Program. One is the structured collection of documents, which is regulations and regulatory documents we refer to Reg Docs, collectively known as the CNSC's Regulatory Framework. The second part is CNSC's participation in the Government of Canada's agenda for legislative and regulatory reform. The overall goal of the program is to provide regulatory instruments that make the CNSC's expectations clear. These expectations must be adapted over time based on experience and in anticipation of an evolving nuclear industry. In working towards this goal, the program takes into account Government of Canada regulatory policy guidance as well as the views of stakeholders and the general public. CNSC staff bring an annual report to the Commission regarding the work of the Regulatory Framework Program. The annual report we are discussing today covers the period since the last report was submitted, as I said earlier, in September of 2016. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Tory. CNSC's regulatory framework includes the structured, comprehensive suite of regulatory instruments that are used to achieve CNSC's mandate. At the top of the pyramid, you see the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, which establishes the Commission, sets out its mandate, and establishes its authority to regulate the development, production, and use of nuclear energy, and the production, possession, and use of nuclear substances, prescribed equipment, and prescribed information in Canada. The Act authorizes the Commission to make regulations, subject to Governor and Council approval, which set out requirements. Licensees or applicants must meet these requirements to obtain or retain a license or certificate to use nuclear materials or operate a nuclear facility. Licenses and certificates set out more specific legally binding requirements to which the CNSC will expect compliance. Moving down the triangle, our regulatory documents provide greater detail than regulations as to what the licensees and applicants must achieve in order to meet the CNSC's regulatory requirements, and may provide also practical guidance on how to meet the regulatory requirements of the CNSC. As a responsible regulator, the CNSC follows the Cabinet Directive on Regulatory Management to ensure that regulatory issues are well defined and that the choice of regulatory approach is the most appropriate for achieving safety and security objectives. This includes re-examining previous ways of doing things, exploring options, and in cases of new or very different ways of regulating, consulting early with stakeholders through workshops or discussion papers. The CNSC continually reviews and adjusts its regulatory framework to ensure that regulatory requirements are modern, clear, and supported by guidance where necessary, and that the CNSC is ready to regulate new and emerging technologies, such as small modular reactors. The regulatory framework program is guided by the Regulatory Framework Steering Committee and the CNSC's Management Committee. This slide shows the CNSC's 13 regulations depicted in 3 general categories. The regulations of facilities and activities mostly set out requirements that license applicants must meet. The regulations of general application on the right apply to differing degrees to all licensees and, in some cases, to non-licensees, such as in the case for transporters of nuclear materials and substances. The third set of regulations relate to the conduct of the CNSC's business, including cost recovery, and the conduct of the Commission's proceedings. The CNSC regularly reviews its suite of regulations and makes amendments as needed to ensure that Canadians and CNSC-regulated parties continue to be supported by an effective, efficient, and modern regulatory framework. Ongoing reviews of regulations are described later in this presentation. There were 3 categories in the previous slide. There are 3 general categories in this slide as well. All regulatory documents published by the CNSC are now aligned within the document framework shown on this slide. The documents are organized into 3 broad categories similar to the regulations. The first outlines expectations specific to different regulated facilities and activities, generally in the form of guidance on how to apply for a license. The second provides requirements and guidance in specific technical areas according to the Safety and Control Area framework that is also used in licensing and compliance, and which you are no doubt familiar. The third covers all remaining areas that warrant clarity through our regulatory framework. So within these 3 categories, there are 26 areas or series, as we refer to them, listed above. For each series, there is a list of reg docs to be published. For example, if you go to 2.7, radiation protection, below that there are 2 regulatory documents, Reg Doc 2.7.1, radiation protection, and 2.7.2 on dosimetry. There are 58 reg docs in total published or planned under this regulatory framework, a regulatory document structure. To date, a total of 28 of these have been published. The CNSC has a rolling 5-year regulatory framework plan that outlines the plan for developing all of the remaining regulatory documents, as well as for the development of regulations and potential regulatory amendments. Regulatory issues may be identified by CNSC management or staff, the Commission, or external stakeholders. They may stem from things such as operating experience with existing requirements and guidance, advancing technologies, issues of non-compliance due to lack of clarity, new government policies, or international events such as Fukushima, to name a few. So regulatory analysis is undertaken to achieve a clear identification of the regulatory issue, ensure the regulatory project is aligned with the CNSC's mandate, spell out the objective of the regulatory action the CNSC might want to take, identify the expected impact on stakeholders, and determine very early in the process if a discussion paper is appropriate. So just above the analysis box, discussion papers. They're used to obtain very early input from stakeholders. More specifically, they're used when considering amendments to regs or creating new regulations. For example, our discussion paper in 2015, proposal to amend the nuclear non-proliferation import and export control regulations, where CNSC proposed updates to align with new international guidance. Discussion papers may also be used when proposing regulatory oversight in an area where the CNSC has not previously exercised its authority under the Act. One example is a 2011 discussion paper, Implementation of Financial Guarantees for Licensees, where the CNSC was proposing to extend the requirement for financial guarantees to smaller licensees to which they had not previously been applied. Another use of discussion papers is when the CNSC has considered exercising authority in a different manner than in past practice, such as implementing the administrative monetary penalties, and when the CNSC is considering how it will regulate new or emergent technologies, such as in 2016's discussion paper, Small Modular Reactors, regulatory strategy, approaches, and challenges. So discussion papers are not the only form of outreach, as you can see below the analysis box, that takes place during the analysis phase. Stakeholder workshops, discussions with other nuclear regulators, dialogue with other government entities at all levels, and other forms of outreach all help inform CNSC's approach throughout the analysis and instrument development process. And that's why you can see stakeholder engagement all across the bottom. The output of analysis, then, is the identification of a regulatory instrument to be used, be it a new or amended regulation, a reg doc, or another form of regulatory action. An analysis may identify such instruments that may be used to address the regulatory issue at hand, such as standards developed by the CSA group or use of other third-party standards such as ASME. These may be referenced in regulations, reg docs, or in license conditions. So since the last regulatory framework program update to the Commission in September 2016, we've solicited early public feedback on the following discussion papers. Radiation Protection and Dosimetry sought feedback on the CNSC's proposal to consolidate a number of older regulatory documents that didn't follow the nomenclature in the current structure into two new regulatory documents on dosimetry and on radiation protection, those two I mentioned earlier. Radioactive Waste Management and Decommissioning sought early feedback on proposals to improve clarity of the CNSC's regulatory framework for radioactive waste management and decommissioning. The CNSC is currently reviewing its approach to regulating in this area and will be modernizing a number of regulatory documents over the next couple of years. Small modular reactors, regulatory strategy, approaches, and challenges was published in 2016, and the What We Heard report was published recently on September 19th. It outlines the next steps in providing further clarity to the regulatory framework for SMRs. First, the CNSC is moving forward with amendments to the nuclear security regulations to remove prescriptive requirements that were established for large nuclear power plants. The plan is to replace these with objective-based requirements that will provide flexibility for new technologies to achieve the same level of security using different approaches. Second, next step is to provide greater clarity on application of the graded approach in reviewing license applications for SMRs. The CNSC is hosting a workshop on the subject on November 24th, 2017. A synopsis of this workshop will be published, and the input received will be considered as the CNSC seeks to provide greater clarity of requirements for small modular reactor applicants. Third, the CNSC will provide greater clarity on licensing for SMRs through the publication of a license application guide, reg doc, for SMRs. We're targeting publication of this document in March of 2018. The CNSC published DIS 1605 Human Performance to develop a shared understanding of how human performance with industry and to open a dialogue with interested stakeholders about how the CNSC considers human performance in its regulatory framework. Feedback received will inform development of a document on human performance. Finally, recovery in the event of a nuclear or radiological emergency is a broad and complex manner that will impact many levels of government and numerous emergency response organizations. To begin addressing these complexities and collect early feedback, the CNSC worked with multiple organizations to publish Framework for Recovery in the Event of a Nuclear or Radiological Emergency. This paper, which was published in August of 2017, describes the measures that the decision makers may need to consider prior to or following the response to an emergency. The CNSC is currently developing a regulatory document on this matter. Thank you. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Karen Owen-Wittred.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Karen Owen-Wittred, Director of the Regulatory Framework Division. As noted earlier, one of the instruments that can come out of regulatory issue analysis is the development or amendment of regulations. This slide outlines the process for developing regulations, and I will just run through these steps at a fairly high level. We've broken the process into 3 steps: developing the proposal, developing the package, and making the regulations. Within the first step, I want to highlight the importance of early consultation. When considering a regulatory amendment, the CNSC engages with stakeholders very early in the process through information sessions, workshops, presentations at conferences, discussion papers, etc. Based on these early consultations, a draft regulatory package is prepared, including the draft regulations and a regulatory impact analysis statement. The Commission is briefed on the proposed changes through an in-camera session. The package is finalized and all the necessary approvals are obtained. The ultimate approval to consult on the draft is required by Governor and Council. Assuming that approval is received, the draft regulations are then published in Canada Gazette Part 1, typically for a 30-day consultation period. The feedback received through the Canada Gazette 1 process is considered in developing the final regulatory package. At this point, the updated proposed regulation package is presented to the Commission in order to make the regulations. Following Commission approval, the final package is brought to the Governor and Council for approval to publish in Canada Gazette Part 2, which brings the regulations into force. The next 2 slides highlight the regulatory packages on which CNSC staff are currently working. First of all, over the past year, CNSC staff finalized amendments to the Radiation Protection Regulations, Class 1 Nuclear Facilities Regulations, and Uranium Mines and Mills Regulations. The amendments, which address lessons learned from the Fukushima accident, were published in Canada Gazette Part 2 on October 4th, 2017. Given the changes to international benchmarks and the adoption of new radiation protection guidance worldwide, CNSC staff have determined that the radiation protection regulations should be reviewed and modernized. Staff have also identified opportunities to improve the regulations to clarify requirements. We are currently working with the Department of Justice on drafting the proposed regulations and are targeting public consultation in Canada Gazette Part 1 in early 2018. CNSC staff are also currently working on proposed amendments to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Import and Export Control Regulations in order to modernize these and to align with current international guidelines for the control of nuclear and nuclear-related imports and exports. For this project, the CNSC is targeting public consultation in Canada Gazette Part 1 in the spring of 2018. Finally, the last major revision of the nuclear security regulations was completed in 2006. Since then, there have been a number of drivers for amendments to the regulations, such as evolving security threats, technological advances, small modular reactors, and operational experience. CNSC staff have conducted early consultation with stakeholders to obtain input into the review. In the past year, the CNSC organized 3 workshops with stakeholders who are directly responsible for implementing security measures at nuclear facilities or responsible for the security of nuclear material. The CNSC is targeting public consultation for these amendments in Canada Gazette Part 1 in 2019. The second regulatory instrument we manage are regulatory documents, which are described in the next few slides. Prior to the reorganization of the CNSC's regulatory document framework, a variety of regulatory instruments were used to clarify requirements and provide guidance. At one time, there were over 150 regulatory documents in the framework library under different nomenclatures, ranging from policies to standards, guides, and requirements. A review of the regulatory document framework, which began in 2009, found that there were no regulatory gaps. Nonetheless, it was decided that the clarity of the framework could be improved by adopting a more logical structure and naming nomenclature, and by consolidating and reducing the total number of regulatory documents. This improvement initiative began in 2013 with a 5-year timeline, the goal being to complete the full migration of existing documents into the new structured framework by 2018. Since the last update to the Commission in September 2016, we have continued to actively clarify our regulatory expectations in various areas of the framework through the publication of reg docs, such as some of the ones shown on this slide. I won't read through the individual titles, but as you can see, this slide lists 8 of the 12 regulatory documents that have been published since September 2016. The most recent being Reg Doc 1.1.3, License Application Guide for License to Operate a Nuclear Power Plant, which was brought to the Commission for approval to publish in August of this year. Overall, CNSC staff have continued to make steady progress on our regulatory document framework modernization project, and we have already achieved a framework that is clearer, more transparent, and more responsive to emerging issues. Recall that the document framework consists of a planned 26 series comprised of 58 reg docs. In total, since the beginning of the project in 2013, we have published 28 reg docs. In many cases, a single reg doc consolidates information from multiple legacy documents. As a result, out of the more than 150 legacy documents referred to earlier, only 61 remain to be reviewed and converted into the new document framework. While this represents a significant accomplishment, it is clear that work remains to be done, particularly in light of the original 5-year plan. Over the course of the document framework modernization initiative, staff have encountered challenges that have affected the project timeline. The results of the past 2 years indicate a steady trend of publishing 7 to 8 reg docs per year, which is fewer than originally planned. One of the reasons for this is the value that we place on stakeholder consultation. In many cases, we have increased our standard consultation period for draft reg docs from 60 days to 90 or even 120 days in response to stakeholder requests for more time. This allows us to better explore regulatory issues with stakeholders and ensure that all points of view are well understood. However, it can extend project timelines beyond what was planned. Furthermore, we recognize that the pace of reg doc development can create consultation fatigue for stakeholders, which is something we try to take into account. In addition, other operational priorities can challenge CNSC's staff's ability to dedicate significant resources to support the development of regulatory documents. As a result of these challenges, the original 2018 objective has been revised. So as indicated earlier, 28 reg docs have been published to date out of a planned 58. That leaves us with 30 reg docs to be published, which will collectively supersede the remaining 61 legacy documents. Based on our performance thus far, we have set a stretch goal of publishing 10 reg docs per year over the next 3 years in order to complete the modernization of the regulatory document framework by 2020. While this is an ambitious goal, it includes the planned republication of certain legacy documents that have been reviewed and reaffirmed by CNSC staff, with the new framework naming and nomenclature. Since these republications involve essentially repackaging existing documents, they are developed and published relatively quickly. While the revised plan, which is published annually on the CNSC website, maps out regulatory projects over the coming years, the regulatory document framework continues to be responsive to emerging regulatory issues, which can lead to changes in project prioritization. For example, CNSC staff are currently prioritizing regulatory documents related to SMRs. To give Commission members a sense of what to expect from the regulatory document framework over the coming months, here are the reg docs that we currently plan to bring to the Commission meetings for the remainder of this fiscal year. I won't read the individual titles, but you can see that there are 2 planned for the Commission meeting in December of 2017 and 3 for March of 2018. Finally, as mentioned earlier in this presentation, in addition to regulations and reg docs, there are other instruments available to the CNSC when considering how to address a regulatory issue. In this respect, the CNSC often leverages international and domestic best practices in the form of standards in establishing regulatory expectations. Nuclear standards produced by the Canadian Standards Association, known as the CSA Group, are a particularly important component of the CNSC's regulatory document framework. Nuclear operators participate with the CSA Group in its standards program to develop consensus-based nuclear-related standards for equipment and performance to improve safety and to reduce risk. The CNSC provides input to these standards and determines whether licensees must meet a standard in whole or in part. Leveraging the work of the CSA Group is a cost-effective way for the CNSC to enhance its regulatory framework. Over the past year, the CNSC and the CSA Group continued their efforts to ensure alignment between the CSA Group Nuclear Standards Program and the CNSC Regulatory Document Framework Program. The CNSC and CSA Group meet regularly to discuss standards and program planning. In order to ensure transparency of regulatory expectations, the CNSC has arranged with the CSA Group for their standards to be available to the public through the CNSC's website. Notification of draft standards issued for public review are also forwarded to the CNSC's almost 4,000 stakeholders through its distribution email list. In addition to CSA standards, we also leverage codes and standards produced by international organizations, such as, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and the American National Standards Institute. I will now turn the presentation back to Mr. Torrey.
Thank you. Regulatory reform has been an important part of the Government of Canada's agenda over the last several years, and CNSC has been and continues to be actively involved. In June 2016, the Government of Canada launched public reviews of environmental and regulatory processes. These reviews focused on 1, environmental assessment processes under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, 2, reviewing the Fisheries and Navigational Protection Act, and modernizing the National Energy Board. Under CIA 2012, the CNSC is responsible for conducting environmental assessments for nuclear projects. For some CNSC licensees, authorizations are required under the Fisheries Act and the Navigation Protection Act. In June 2017, the government published a discussion paper, Environmental and Regulatory Reviews, that summarizes proposed path forward in light of the recommendations of all 4 review processes. The proposed path forward includes several changes concerning environmental assessments, including a proposal to rescope environmental assessment to impact assessment and to consider a broader range of factors, environmental, economic, social, health, and Indigenous knowledge. The discussion paper proposes a single responsible authority for all federal impact assessments. This means the CNSC would no longer be responsible for these assessments for nuclear projects. However, the CNSC would, of course, continue to be responsible for all matters under the NSCA, including environmental protection. The CNSC continues to collaborate with the federal departments and agencies leading these reviews. To conclude, since the last update of the Regulatory Framework Program to the Commission, we have seen another busy year. The CNSC remains connected and in line with government regulatory improvement initiatives. We have continued to modernize the framework through the development of new regulatory documents and regulatory amendments to ensure CNSC's framework continues to reflect the latest developments in domestic and international lessons learned. The CNSC's regulatory framework plan outlines a long-term plan for our regulatory framework. This work plan will remain flexible and adaptable to the latest developments in federal and nuclear regulation. We thank you for your attention and remain available for any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you.